Good afternoon. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of the City Club and the City Club Foundation, I want to extend to all of you a warm and cordial welcome to our regular Friday noon forums. I'm Chester Gray, the 78th president of this most important organization, which I refer to frequently as a learning center. Today, our guest needs no introduction to this audience. He is well known for his philanthropic and civic activities here in Cleveland and elsewhere. He'll be speaking to us on philanthropy, America's most distinctive virtue. And I'm pleased to announce that our program today is the third in an annual series on the subject for philanthropic spirit in community leadership. Funded by the friends and colleagues of the late Jim Lipscomb, former distinguished director of the Gun Foundation and president of the City Club in 1980. Mrs. Lipscomb is out of town and not able to be with us, but we're pleased that the family is represented by Jim's son, Bill. Bill, will you stand, please, so we can do it. Also here is Jim's former colleague at the Gun Foundation, Henry Dahl, a long and distinguished member of the City Club, who was responsible for raising the funds that have made this forum possible. Thank you very much. The philanthropic spirit in community leadership, certainly this reflects the life of Jim Lipscomb here in Cleveland. It also reflects the contributions of our speaker today. Bob Gries, who you all know and love, is not only the manager of two foundations himself, but he has served on numerous boards of directors throughout the land. Where philanthropy is concerned, he served 10 years on the distribution committee of the Cleveland Foundation, 2 terms on the Council on Foundations, including 5 years as the national membership chairman. He also helped organize the Ohio Foundation Conference and chaired its first 2 conferences. He helped organize Grant Makers Forums, chaired its first 4 years. He's manager of 2 foundations himself, and has chaired as recently a life member of the Endowment Fund, Jewish Community Federation, etc. He also has the distinction of serving as a member of the board of directors of my alma mater, John Carroll University. Ladies and gentlemen, will you welcome Bob Gries today?
Thank you, Chet. Thank you, and let me start by saying I am truly delighted to be here and looking out and talking to people in the audience beforehand, to see so many old friends and people with whom I've worked over the years on various projects in Cleveland, and also some of my mentors in the field of philanthropy. I'm also delighted because this talk today is in memory of Jim Lipscomb. Jim was a good friend, and when he wasn't talking football, which was one of his favorite subjects, we were talking philanthropy and talking about the many, many projects that the Gun Foundation and Jim were involved in for the betterment of the city of Cleveland. Jim was a first-rate philanthropist, and he did a great deal for our city. I'm also delighted because I do a reasonable amount of speaking on a wide variety of topics to a diverse group of people. And the one I always enjoy the most is philanthropy, because I think it's the most important, and I think it's the most lasting of all the many subjects. So with that, let's talk about philanthropy for the next hour, and let's start with a definition. I would say the purest form of philanthropy is the giving of one's resources for the benefit of others with no expectation of return except the satisfaction of having done so. And let me suggest to you that it is this act which can truly ennoble mankind. There are many, many species which acquire possessions and power. But what species gives them up voluntarily? A good mind, along with hard work and reasonable amount of luck, can accumulate wealth. But it takes a great soul to want to help those who are less fortunate. Perhaps a sage of my religion said it the best when he said, "If I am not for myself, who will be? But if I'm only for myself, what am I?" Now, in talking about philanthropy, we have to try to put it in perspective. And don't worry, I'm not going to burden you with tremendous number of facts and figures, but I don't think we can understand the subject without looking at some of the facts and figures around this great institution. First of all, what's the scope? What's the total picture of philanthropy? And when I've talked to, there are a lot of sophisticated philanthropists in this room, and some of you probably know a lot of the answers to some of the things I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, but you'd be amazed how few people really do know what is the total scope of philanthropy. Last year in this country, people gave $115 billion toward philanthropy. $115 billion. Now, that's not enormous compared to the amount of money, say, that the government spends through HEW and through transfer payments to individuals in this country. But it's a very sizable amount of money which goes toward innumerable causes. Who gives this money? And when you ask this question, people often say, oh, the corporations and the foundations. And there's no question that corporations and foundations are very important. And in some projects, they are extremely important, and they wouldn't happen without them. But in the total picture, the total amount of corporate giving is about $5 billion. $5 billion. About 4.5% of the total picture. So who gives the rest? Foundations? Foundations last year gave just under $7 billion of that total. About 6%, fraction over 6%. And then there's another 6% that's given by people who die and leave bequests to institutions. So where's all the rest? 85% approximately is given by individuals in this country, by you, by me, by millions of Americans all over this land. 85% of that $115 billion. Over $100 billion by individuals. Okay, where does it all go? And this again surprises a lot of people. The greatest beneficiary of the philanthropic dollar is religion. Religion gets over 45%, but that doesn't all go for religious purposes. About half of that money is used for projects that those religious institutions have to help people, whether with hunger or social services or education or whatever. About half of that 45% is used for programs of those institutions. Who qualifies to get this money? And again, a somewhat shocking figure to people, over 400,000 organizations in this country are qualified. All you have to do is apply to the government and get a 501c3 status. And what does that mean? That means that you can support anything that your heart desires. If you want to feed the hungry, fine. If you want to support studying medieval literature, fine. If you want to support taking care of pets, fine. You name it. There are 400,000 organizations that are qualified to receive the charitable dollar. It's also interesting that this $115 billion provides 25%, about a quarter, of all the money of these 400,000 organizations. Another quarter is supplied by government, and about half is supplied by fees for services by those organizations. How large is this total picture, this total philanthropic movement in the United States? It employs about 7 million people, a very sizable employer when you compare it to other sectors. Now, what are the origins of philanthropy? Well, there are many religious references to helping the unfortunate, to setting a place for the stranger in our midst, injunctions not to glean the corners of your field, but leave them for the poor. But mostly, people have helped each other for a long time, but always with the in-group. In other words, you can find what you could call helpfulness all through the ages, from the most primitive tribes. But people usually helped each other in reciprocal ways. You paint my house and I'll sit with your children. And you take care of this and I'll take care of something else for you. It was what you might call in-group helpfulness. De Tocqueville, when he came through the United States in the 1830s, commented on the incredible propensity of Americans to form voluntary societies. But even these groups, so unlike what existed in Europe at the time and a real phenomenon on the American scene, even these groups were primarily to take care of local specific issues. It was about 100 years ago that the great fortunes of the Industrial Revolution caused the first major foundations that were set aside for the general betterment of mankind. Funds for education, funds for health, funds not for the in-group, but for the unknown needy. Now, some skeptics would say that those foundations, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, were attempts to buy salvation. And I'll leave that to some of the religious members here to decide. But whatever the motives, these men, I can tell you, gave great thought to their grant making. I just finished reading The Gospel of Wealth that Andrew Carnegie wrote over 100 years ago. And although much of it is obviously dated for the times, you would be amazed at the thoughtfulness that was put into the philosophy of his grant making. He knew exactly what he wanted to accomplish and what he wanted to do. And there was tremendous thoughtfulness. And I'd remind you also that Andrew Carnegie was the one who said it is easier to make money than to give it away intelligently. But as I mentioned, it's not the foundations, but the individuals who are 85 to 90% of the charitable dollar. So what does the average person give? This again might surprise you some, but the average person in the United States gives 2% of their revenues. And they contribute 2 hours a week on average, 100 hours a year, of volunteer time. Now, the more generous group that give 5% of their revenues and 5 hours of time comprise 11% of all Americans. And there is a movement around the country today, started by the independent sector, to try to set a standard of 5% of your income and 5 hours of voluntary time per week. Now, that group, incidentally, has a local affiliate called Northern Ohio Gives. And interestingly, when the research was done in Cleveland, and we found that the patterns of giving were quite similar to other areas of the country, we found that most people responded on surveys that they would like to give more. They would like to volunteer more. But what should they do? They didn't know. There is no standard out there among people that they know. Now, there are various groups. We know that the Mormons tithe. We know that there are lots of other groups, and many of you people in this room, who give far, far more than 5% or 10% or whatever. But what is the standard for the average American? There hasn't been one. And so we are leaving untapped all these people who would like to do something more, but they don't know quite what they should be doing. So this effort, I think, is a very important one to try to set a national standard of 5 hours of volunteer time a week and 5% of your revenue to the charitable cause. Now, one of the questions that always comes up when I've served on a panel on philanthropy, the question is inevitably raised, is there enough money out there to support all the organizations that want it? And usually on those panels, the person, the corporate member, the foundation member will say, no, there isn't enough. There are limited dollars. And they are right from their perspective, because their corporation or their foundation, as large as it may be, has limited dollars. But I would submit to you that no organization ever failed because of limited dollars. They fail because they don't know where to find the dollars, or they don't know how to get it. They don't go out and shake the trees, or maybe they don't even know where the forest is. But they don't fail because there are limited dollars out there. Think of the fortunes that are made every single day. You know, when a corporation is acquired, and we've had a lot of that in the 1980s certainly, when a corporation is acquired, I hear all kinds of people bemoaning that there's a diminution of the corporate dollar available for fundraising. And truly, there is some diminution. But how many individual multimillionaires were made as a result of the sale of that corporation? People who suddenly have more money than they ever imagined they would have, and are prime candidates for crossing from the acquisitive stage of life to the distributive stage. If the effort to establish a 5% standard could even increase from 2% to 3%, it would mean a 50% increase in all the dollars available for philanthropy, and it would mean some $55 to $60 billion more. So look at all the potential out there. Now, another interesting fact was discovered in a study a couple of years ago. It was always presumed that the most wealthy 1% in this country were very generous contributors and givers. And the reason for that is that when you take the 1% as a whole, it always turned out that way, that the top 1% give huge amounts of money. But finally, somebody did a study and broke down that 1% group into component parts, like they have broken down other economic groupings. And what did they find? Well, they found that that 1% were just like all the others, all the other groups. 20% of that group were enormous givers. These were the people giving million-dollar gifts, sometimes tens of million-dollar gifts, huge amounts of money. And then there was about 40% who you might say were average givers. They gave, and the amounts they gave, because they had a lot of money, were sizable, but percentage-wise, they were not giving much better than the average people in this country. And then there were 40% who were either non-givers or very minimal type givers. Look at the potential. If we could even persuade a small number of those people to become great givers or become givers at all, there's a tremendous potential out there. So the job is not the amount of money available. It's the education and selling of the philanthropic principle. Now, other questions and thoughts about philanthropy. Often hear the question, are taxes the motivation for giving? Categorically, I would answer no. Yes, they have some influence, but some of the people in this room are old enough to remember, as I can when I first came into the business world, when the top tax rate was 91%. People have forgotten that, and when you say it, it sometimes shocks them into some very unpleasant memories. But 91% was the top tax rate. It only cost 9 cents for every dollar you gave away in those days. What a motivation. And yet, when they lowered the top tax rate from 91 to 70, to 50, to 28, now it's gone up a little to 31, but with all of those lowerings, the increases in philanthropy continued, and they continued not just average, but in geometric proportions. So taxes may have some influence, and certainly do on some types of gifts, but they are not, in general, the major cause. So why do people give? They give for salvation. They give for recognition. They give for perpetuity. And they give just to be generous, to do good, and because they think they should. And then the most enlightened, I think, give for the joy and the satisfaction, because it's fun to give if you're doing things you truly enjoy. Another question that's often asked, is philanthropy unique to our country? No, it's not unique, but without question, it has reached the highest form in the United States. One interesting fact that I came upon was that in many languages of this world, there was no word, or is no word, for philanthropy, which means giving without any expectation of return. And when President Kennedy started the Peace Corps in the early 60s, what was it? It was an effort for Americans to go around the world to less advantaged areas and teach English, teach agriculture, teach health, and countries were suspicious. They wanted to know, what did we want in return? And when it was tried to explain to them, in many cases, this took a long time and it was very difficult because there was not even a word in their languages that really described philanthropy as we know it in the United States. Now, just a word on what's different about philanthropy in Cleveland. First of all, we have the greatest tradition of any city in the country. We were the originator of the United Way concept. And after all these years, we are still the highest per capita givers to the United Way. We were the originators of the community foundation concept. And for a long time, we were part of a very small group of cities that had community foundations. But that has mushroomed in the last generation enormously. But Cleveland today has a community foundation that when I last heard, and it changes continually with the stock market, but was over $600 million, and that really is an agenda setter in our city. Now, we also have a very major private foundation in the Gun Foundation, and we have many small foundations. But what is different is that almost every city in the United States have some huge private foundations and a much smaller community foundation. I prefer our model because it makes the community foundation the pace setter, and that means that our agendas are set by highly professional staff who have a mission to serve the entire city of Cleveland and its environs, which I think is the best way to go, and I think we are unique among the cities of the United States in that aspect. Now, to close, I'd like to say that I know you're all generous, all of you in this room, all of the people who will listen to this on the radio, etc. But why not give even more? Why shouldn't you, as generous as you are, be given even more? And let me just say 4 ideas to hopefully stimulate you in that direction. First of all, as mentioned before, your first obligation is always to yourself. But as I said earlier, if I'm only for myself, what am I? Secondly, you've all been helped. I hear people that say to me at times, nobody ever helped me. I worked hard. I made every cent I ever did, and nobody ever did anything for me. So why should I go ahead and do for others? When my children were seniors in college, I told them that their tuition, as great as it was, and it's getting even greater, but that their tuition payments only represented 1/3 of the cost of educating them. Where did the rest come from? Came from other people who contributed to that university, and it came from people who left endowments so that future generations could get the same education or a better education than they got. And I told them that it was their obligation, when they were in a position to do so, to make up that gap and do a lot more if they could, so that future generations could go on being educated as they had been by others. If you've ever been in a hospital, you've been subsidized by the philanthropic dollar. If you've ever been to a Y or a JCC for recreation, you've been subsidized. If you've ever been a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout, and I could go on to things we don't think about, but all of those things are subsidized by the philanthropic dollar. I dare say that there are very few people in our country who somewhere along the line have not been helped and subsidized by the philanthropic dollar. Thirdly, we live in a city that has been good to us. We've all had our degrees of prosperity in this city, and shouldn't we be giving something back to it to make it an even better city? And lastly, I would suggest that the philanthropic tradition in the United States is truly its most distinctive virtue. It should be nurtured, and it should be fun to be a part of it. Some people, when trying to raise money, say you should give till it hurts. I would suggest you should give till it feels good. Thank you for letting me share some of my ideas.
Thank you so much. You said a few times about that.
Oh.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Thank you very, very much, Bob, for not only an informative presentation, but also a challenging one. I know that many of you, and myself included, have learned some things that we really didn't know before. It was obvious that your speech was well accepted because Mrs. Gries, who is sitting right in front of me, was intently concerned, and at no time did she shake her finger about you made a mistake. Welcome to our forum indeed. You've been listening, radio audience and vast TV audience, to Bob Gries speaking on philanthropy. And this was made possible through the philanthropy of one of our former members in the person of Jim Lipscomb, whose son is here with us today. Now, I have a few announcements before we enter into our regular question period. First of all, let me suggest that no better Christmas gift could be given by any of you members than to another potential member. And so that they will enjoy these forums in our weekday, or rather noonday programs throughout the year. I want you to know that the year 1991, the City Club is devoting much of its time to the Bill of Rights, whose 200th anniversary is December 15th, 1991. And we're going to program throughout that year with a series of excellent programs under the chairmanship of Ben Schaus and also Elizabeth Dreyfus, who are members of that, who are co-leaders of that committee and are working very hard. You don't want to miss those, really. And then, of course, after we kick off the Bill of Rights program on January the 4th, I believe, we're going to have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Mr. Moyer, followed by a very outstanding American, former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who will be here to discuss many of the aspects of what the Bill of Rights is all about. Why is it that it glues us as Americans together? And then we're going to have the publisher of Penthouse, which will be an interesting session. I suggest you make your reservations today for that forum so that you'll be sure and have a seat. And then following, later on, the ambassador from Turkey, and then Mayor Mike White will make his annual summary of his first year in office. And I perhaps will have to say to that audience, which is what I want to say to this audience, that if you feel compelled to make a speech, hold it and we'll program you at another time and another place, because time is of the essence, and I know that Bob Gries wants to answer your questions. We have two microphones. Alan Davis in the front, Bob Conrad in the rear, and I'd like for you to know who is going to have the first question, please.
Bob, your remarks were most appropriate and most eloquent, especially this time of the year. And my question is this. With the many, many proposals that you must receive all the time from very needy and very worthwhile organizations, how do you personally determine who's to get what and when?
Thank you. You know, that's a question so often asked because everyone is besieged with requests, and today in the age of the word processor and with the proliferation of development directors, which I think increased fivefold in the 80s, the number of requests has multiplied geometrically. And I would submit to you that first of all, you have to realize this is not a choice between good and bad. It's not between right and wrong. Nobody can sit and tear their hair out over whether they should be providing basics like feeding the hungry or providing clothing, or whether they should provide a long-range benefit like education, or whether they should support culture. All of these are good things and all of them are necessary. What I suggest to people is do what makes you feel good. Do what gives you that warm and fuzzy feeling Because if you do what you want to do with your charitable dollar, you'll add more zeros to the check. And I think that the decisions have to be, they're difficult. You don't like to turn anything down, but you have to start with the feeling that you can only do so much depending on what your resources are, and you should do those things that give you the greatest pleasure. Part of the greatness of American philanthropy is that we have those 400,000 organizations out there, and nobody sits in Washington, in Columbus, or anywhere else and says, you must do this one or that one. It's up to you, and you should do what gives you the greatest pleasure in doing it.
Bob, as you know, trustees are fiduciaries, and as fiduciaries, they're under certain legal constraints to act reasonably and prudently. Can they, consistent with that duty, still take risks and be on the cutting edge of philanthropy?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I think if anyone doesn't know in this room, they should know it, that under Ohio law and under a law that was passed a few years ago, trustees who do not receive any compensation for their services and who serve 501c3 organizations cannot be or have very limited legal liability. In other words, unless you totally ignore a board you're on and you let it do some horrendous things, you do not have to have the same standards of responsibility as you do with a profit-making organization. But when you talk about risk-taking, you know, that's an interesting subject because some people, some skeptics, have written articles saying that only 3% of philanthropy is risk-taking. And I disagree with that totally. What they are talking about are new organizations. They're talking about a new organization developed to be on the cutting edge of society. But I say to you that there is risk-taking by very traditional organizations. And I could give you a lot of examples. For instance, if the Cleveland Orchestra goes and plays in public square to people who have never heard it and never had a chance to see it, that's new and different, and that's risk-taking. If the Cleveland Opera goes out and plays programs for the elderly, for shut-ins, for students who don't get to see it otherwise, that's a new and creative program. If a traditional old organization like the Boy Scouts decides to try to do something in the Hispanic community where there has never been such activity, they are taking risks. And let me just mention one I heard about the other day of a wonderful program. University hospitals, a great old institution in this city, has a remarkable lady who is a music therapist and who started programs for the very ill. And a lot of people thought that those programs, they made people feel better, and so they were good, you know, and a little sort of helpfulness. But just recently, they proved scientifically that those programs increase the immune system of those very ill patients and help them to fight the diseases with which they're afflicted. Now, if that isn't risk-taking, I don't know what is. So I think we have risk-taking by all kinds of organizations and all through our philanthropic movement.
You know, every Friday I hear Chester Gray say that we shouldn't make a speech, but we should see Ben Skull and he'll schedule us. And I saw Ben and he wouldn't schedule me. So I'll just ask Bob a question and not make a speech. Bob, you described the innovative nature and the of the Cleveland foundations, that they were the first, and in most people's mind, they're the best. How do they interchange with the small, independent local foundations and with individuals? How are they coordinated to improve that record? And is there any way that individual foundations might jump on the bandwagon and contribute to that progress?
Well, there are many, many ways that Cleveland Foundation interacts. I couldn't begin to mention all of them, but let me just tell you a few that come to mind. First of all, Cleveland Foundation was the one that really started the Grant Makers Forum, which is an association of the smaller foundations throughout our area. And through that, they have maintained and kept contact and helped guide the smaller foundations. Secondly, their staff is a resource for smaller foundations all over this city. I mean, I've called and talked to staff members many times, and so have other foundations, when we want to know about particular projects, particular institutions, and we want some guidance in guiding our own grant making. They have just innumerable programs. I think you could give a whole speech, but I think you'll have to get Steve Minner to give that speech on what the Cleveland Foundation does, because I think they are the major force in grant making in our city. And let me say one other thing that's different about them than some foundations. They chose some years ago to be proactive rather than just reactive. In their early days, they reacted to those requests that were submitted to them. And it operated in a fairly simple way up until about the 1960s. And then it changed. And they decided to go out there and figure out what the needs are in this city. And where somebody wasn't requesting money for it, they went out and they created the organization or created the program, sometimes bringing together organizations to do that program. So they've been a proactive force, and that's why they're an agenda setter in this city.
Mr. Gries, a few times this afternoon the mention has been made of feeding the hungry and caring for the homeless. This is I guess, a philosophic question. Is there a point at which government is reneging on its responsibility and allowing philanthropic organizations to care for some of the social needs, thereby the social needs being met by a few rather than by the total community? Where is that cutoff point where government is reneging on its responsibility by allowing the philanthropic organizations to bear the burden?
Well, I think the answer, is there a point? Yes, there is a point. There is no question that providing the basic needs of people in our society is not the job of the philanthropic community. They're there to help, and they're there to do their part in a variety of ways. But the basic job of seeing that people have food, clothing, and shelter belongs to the government. Now, where do foundations fit into the picture? When government cannot react quickly enough, when you have certain emergencies, foundations should address the problem and should, in my opinion, fill the gap. Now, I can tell you times in the past that all of a sudden, because of a recession, because of other things, there was a great increase in the number of people needing basic services, which couldn't be provided that quickly by the government. And foundations set up programs to serve those people, led often by the Cleveland Foundation in this community. I argued in those days that those were very important things to do, but that to continue those year in, year out, providing those services was not the basic philosophical job of the foundations, that they should be providing those needs and should be lobbying the government to do what they're supposed to do, and then getting on to other things. So what I'm saying to you is I think when there is a sudden problem, an emergency problem, foundations obviously should come to the fore. But to take on the ongoing job, that is not the foundation's overall responsibility.
Sir, my question is about giving money to what we would consider the poorest of the poor. First, I want to say about the Rockefeller Foundation that a scientist there at Avery in 1944 proved that DNA is the bearer of the genetic message. It was one of the greatest accomplishments of all time. But for more down-to-earth philanthropy, would it not get money to the poorest of the poor if one simply took the names of the churches in the poor neighborhoods and found out the pastor's name and simply mailed money to the pastor, and that would cut down the overhead. And the idea is that leave it up to him to give it to the poorest of the poor.
Well, you certainly have an innovative approach to it. You know, as I mentioned earlier, 45% of the $115 billion does go to religious organizations, and about half of that amount then gets spent by those organizations on services to people who need it, some of whom I'm sure are those you're mentioning, the poorest of the poor. Whether you can shortcut this by just mailing it to the pastor, I don't think the pastor himself is a 501c3. I think you probably do have to give it to the institution and go through at least that much red tape. But certainly providing money to churches in poor neighborhoods who in turn have programs to serve their neighbors and their constituents is a way to be helpful.
Mr. Gries, I'm very proud and also very thankful for being one of the beneficiaries of the philanthropist ideas of the United States. I'd like to expand on your views of Cleveland and the United States a little bit more. Do you agree that one of our real assets is in the field of philanthropists could be actually exported to the countries that are extremely wealthy, and they could expand their philanthropist type contributions to their own brothers that are definitely in need of those type of helps, and in this way help the peace in the areas that are really in trouble now?
Absolutely. It not only can be done, but to some extent it is being done today. In recent years, other countries have taken a considerable interest. Germany has had an interest, Japan has had an interest, even Russia has some interest and has sent people over to see what's going on in the philanthropic field, and certainly a lot of other countries around. The one thing that we must be careful of, though, is whenever you export something, people don't accept your exports exactly the way you necessarily do them. And I think we should be very cautious to realize that people have their own cultures, they have their own ideas about how to help their societies, and we should tell them what we are doing. We should help them in any way we can wherever they want our help, but we should not try to think that we can simply sell our philanthropic idea, as wonderful as it is, to countries throughout the world. I think, though, we can make a great deal of progress, and I agree with you, it would do a lot for the peace of the world.
Bob, have recent tax limitations stifled any giving in the United States? And also, does the independent sector lobby in order to assure that the laws do not limit giving unnecessarily?
Oh, believe me, they lobby. And so does the Council on Foundations, so that there is plenty of lobbying to try to convince our people in Congress of how they should be treating the philanthropic tax deductions. And I would say that there's a movement, and we've done it here too, to meet with all of our Congress people and to tell them and explain to them. In fact, what we did here was we sent to them a complete printout of all the contributions that were made in their districts or in their areas. And believe me, it was this thick, and I'm sure they didn't read through it, but they were impressed by the bulk. And we spent time talking to them at dinner meetings about what philanthropy is all about. So I think in this area, at least, we have some very good friends in Congress. We're encouraging that to take place in other areas around the country. Is it inhibiting? Any restriction does some inhibition. When they made the most recent changes, all the organizations were crying that this is going to have this effect and that effect. Most of those didn't happen. The one area where there was a great change was because of the change in appreciated securities. Gifts of works of art and treasures of that type went down by about half last year to museums and other institutions of that type, because they didn't let you take the deduction anymore for the appreciation of that. Now they've changed that a little bit where you get a one-year window next year, and it'll be interesting to see. There may be a lot of gifts made next year because you have a one-year window now to give those and not be subject to the AMT tax. But, every time Congress meddles, they have some effect. But it certainly hasn't been a disastrous effect, as you can see by the double-digit increase in giving last year by individuals.
Mr. Gries, as was announced or stated earlier, we are receiving, of course, many, many requests for gifts. Some of these requests we are not aware of. We do not know the organization. How can we find out how much of that dollar goes to administration rather than to help the organization?
Well, first of all, you can, I'm not sure whether we have in Ohio yet a requirement. I think there is a requirement now that, at least on phone solicitations, that they have to tell you certain answers like that. Now, what I would say to you is, first thing you can do is ask. Second thing you can do is ask them to send you something in the mail that puts it in writing. Because if they do that and it's not true, you could just send it down to the Attorney General, and then you might get the state, and you might get some action. If it's just an organization you don't know anything about, there are various places, like the Cleveland Foundation, where you could call and ask if they know that organization, if it's a local one, and could give you some assistance in their evaluation of it and whether they think it's worth supporting. There's also, in the local area, there's a group of that corporations support that passes muster, and you can see if it's on that list. And all I can tell you is just probe and ask the questions, and if you're not satisfied with the answers, then give to something else, because there are plenty of organizations who will give you the answers.
Sir, at one point you commented on teaching philanthropy. Isn't it necessary to interest people in specific programs rather than philanthropy in general? Can you really teach philanthropy for itself?
Yes, I believe you can. And I know I do a lot of it. Sometimes it doesn't make me the best fundraiser in the world because I'm not as single-focused, although I try to represent the causes I collect for as well as I can. But I believe in getting people to give, and give as much as they can be persuaded to give. And if they choose to give it to things that are on their agenda rather than on mine, I can't really get upset with them if they are giving and giving generously. So yes, I think I've talked to many, many people. I've encouraged people to set up foundations when they have sufficient wealth to do so. And that's encouraging people to give money and then decide what they want to give it to. So yes, I think you can teach philanthropy in general. You don't have to teach it only through specific issues.
Hi. I understand that hospitals have a bad name right now in the funding community because of cost containment issues and so forth. I'm with a small community hospital that served over 10,000 indigent people last year. I'm wondering if it's true that there's a negative feeling towards hospitals.
No, I don't think so. Obviously, people are concerned about cost containment, and they should be. But hospitals are addressing that, and they're dealing with it better than I've ever seen, and I've been on hospital boards for over 30 years of 3 different hospitals. I think No, I think also the health field received double-digit increases in funding last year, so I don't see any trend in general in any ill feeling toward hospital giving. I think we're just about, are we out of time? One more.
Mr. Gries, I wondered if you might compare your role as a philanthropic giver to your more for-profit role in the area of investing in companies. Are there any similarities in the analysis you do of the kind of things you give to or the companies you invest in? Is there any similarity or differences in the returns you expect? Kinds of situations.
Yes, I wish you'd asked that to me about 10 minutes ago, because I don't think I would have time to answer it all now, but let me just say very quickly, there's a great similarity. In philanthropy, there are a lot of small projects, just like there are small companies in the venture capital field. You have to take great risks. You shouldn't expect perfection. You shouldn't expect to always succeed. Some people set, in business, 50% of the products that are brought to market fail. In some industries, a lot greater than 50%. And yet we expect philanthropy to be perfect. We set a higher standard for it as if everything we should do should come out well. But I think the success rate in philanthropy is greater than in business, certainly is greater than in government, and I think it speaks well for itself. And let me just say one final word as to what I see as the future of philanthropy. I think it's doing very well in this country, and if anybody's worried about the generation of the 80s and the somewhat selfish attitude we all went through in the 80s, I can tell you that recent studies have shown that the children of that era are volunteering more and giving more than in any previous generation. So I think the future and the prognosis for a continuation of the philanthropic movement is excellent.
Thank you very much. The forum is adjourned.